Thank you, Molly, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming here today to listen to my talk. I'm really excited to be here both as a new member of the Queen's community and the English department here, and I'm looking forward to getting to share some of my research with you today. So I thought it might be helpful to begin by situating this research within my work as a postdoc here at Queen's, which is to say that initially I really wanted to talk about my new research project and discuss my process of preparation for some archival research trips, which is kind of what I'm working on right now, and would be happy to talk about later if we want to. But when I started to put that talk together, it really came across as pretty dull. It wasn't good. The fact is that early work on a research project is really just a series of sprawling and deepening questions, and I'm not even sure that I've gotten to the most interesting questions yet. So instead, what I'm going to talk about today comes out of my dissertation project, which I've been revising and editing for submission to publishers, also as part of my work as a postdoc here at Queen's. So the process of moving from a dissertation to a book is a difficult one that I'm still working on, but it seems to me that it also has to do with this idea of refining your questions and kind of digging down to figure out what it was that your dissertation was really all about, because by the time you're finishing grad school, it's really just about getting it done and sort of putting it in the ground. So how do you dig it up and then turn it into a book? So my dissertation project examined changing cultural approaches to desertification in the US from the 1930s to our contemporary moment. But what I'd like to talk to you about today is the question that sort of sits at the heart of my book project, the central tension that holds it all together, which is, what do we do with desertification? Now, in order to understand this question, you need to understand that desertification is a term that has presented a problem to a wide community of scholars, politicians, and scientists working on drylands, in and on drylands rather, for the last 50 years at least. The problem is that desertification, which has many definitions, but generally refers to the spread of desert-like conditions resulting from severe drought and land degradation, is actually a pretty terrible way of thinking about both of those issues. As I'll discuss in more detail in a few minutes' time, neither drought nor land degradation result in the creation or spread of desert lands. Despite this, desertification has been the primary way that severe land degradation and drought have been framed as environmental crises since the late 1970s. The term and its concept is effectively baked into international environmental policy due to its continued use by the United Nations, which essentially means that simply replacing desertification with another term, perhaps a more accurate alternative, would be difficult to say the least. So, what do we do? Now, my work doesn't seek to answer that question directly, as others have, by suggesting an alternative terminology, for example. Rather, I argue for the need to keep this question open and consider instead what we could do with desertification, since it's sticking around anyways. And what we could do with desertification, not as a basis for policymaking or scientific investigation in dry lands, for which it seems pretty poorly suited, but instead as an imaginative tool with a set of discursive ideas, some of which have aided a public imagining of severe land degradation and drought throughout much of the 20th century. In essence, my work analyzes the discursive functioning of this idea in order to consider how we might reimagine or reconstruct some of its cultural narratives to serve efforts to communicate the scale and threat of environmental crisis in drylands. So I'd like to begin my talk with an example of how desertification has been utilized for the communication of environmental crisis. So this is a photograph depicting the 1930s Dust Bowl, a period of severe drought in the US Great Plains that, combined with the socioeconomic hardships of the Great Depression and years of farming and land use practices that were ill-suited to the region, resulted in catastrophic soil erosion. And this was characterized primarily by these huge dust storms, like you can see here, these towering clouds of black soil that blew across the country and caused a range of issues, as you can imagine. It doesn't really look very good. Now, this photograph in particular comes from the Resettlement Administration, which would later become the better-known Farm Security Administration, or FSA, that people might be a little bit more familiar with. And this was one of the government agencies established as part of President Roosevelt's New Deal, which was a suite of social welfare-based policies and programs designed to help alleviate the hardships of the Great Depression years. So as part of that project, the Resettlement Administration sent out photographers to the Dust Bowl region as well as elsewhere much more broadly across the U.S. to document what was happening, to raise awareness, and to bolster public support. This photographic project, organized through what was called the historical section of the Resettlement Administration, or RA, is now this incredible historical resource documenting the lives of people living through these hard years. However, as other scholars have pointed out, these images did more than simply record life in this period. They were also crafted to serve a very particular purpose, to publicize and promote the work of the Resettlement Administration and the New Deal as a whole. So this photograph is a really good example of this, right? Because it's obviously not documentary. There's a giant cow skull in the dust cloud, right? That didn't happen. So it's a good example of how these works served a purpose. So in particular, this example is a composite made of two images from the RA's photographic project. The first of which is this photograph of an oncoming dust storm in Colorado taken by D.L. Kernodle in 1936, and the second being this image of a cow skull taken by Arthur Rothstein in May of the same year in South Dakota. So the composite was created for use in an exhibit promoting the work of the Resettlement Administration, a kind of public exhibition that was common during this period, and was especially used by programs like the RA to kind of publicize the New Deal and what they were doing. And so it was used to promote the work that the RA was doing, which often included buying up degraded land for rehabilitation, a process that sometimes involved resettlement, hence the name Resettlement Administration. So this is the full-page spread of the exhibit. That's, here's some giggles. It is a funny image, right? It's kind of over the top. So this is the full-page spread from that exhibit that was used and created to publicize the work that they were doing. And you can see that the Dust Bowl image is meant to represent what the caption describes as wasted, worn-out land. So the dried-out, desiccated cow skull aids this representation as a popular symbol of desert conditions, alongside parched earth, sparse vegetation, things that we might note are very clearly represented in Rothstein's image here. So superimposing Rothstein's skull over Kernodle's oncoming dust storm therefore creates this really potent representation of a very particular fear that the Dust Bowl was transforming the Great Plains into a kind of lifeless desert, a process that we would today call desertification. And so this is really what my work is interested in, how desertification is employed to craft narratives of environmental crisis. In this case, it's being used to establish the scale and threat of the Dust Bowl disaster. These narratives are often visually compelling, I think we could call this compelling, complex, and also really rather politically useful. For instance, in the full image of the exhibit here, we can see that the image of death and destruction is juxtaposed above this trio of young swimmers preparing to plunge into a freshwater lake on lands acquired and presumably successfully rehabilitated through the Resettlement Administration's programs. And so the implication is that as bad as things are, the environmental crisis of the Dust Bowl can be alleviated through swift government action. So at first glance, this sort of appears like a potentially successful representation of environmental crisis, perhaps a bit heavy-handed in its depiction of disaster, but it works. It's saying with political action, we can address environmental crisis. But this image of the Dust Bowl as a kind of encroaching desert front is more than an exaggeration. It's also a dangerously misleading and flawed representation of drought and land degradation. In truth, no amount of drought or land degradation will result in the creation or spread of desert land, for the simple reason that deserts are not dead, empty wastelands. They are, in fact, vibrant, diverse ecosystems. So the heavily eroded lands created by the Dust Bowl were not deserts. The use of desert imagery within this photograph and many similar representations that were around in the Dust Bowl period, from the 1930s especially, relied on a common misunderstanding of deserts as broken, lifeless wastelands that is still prevalent today. And in fact, one of the photographs from this composite, the desiccated skull image, was accused of just this kind of misrepresentation in what's been called the cow skull controversy. So Rothstein took a lot of images with that cow skull, is essentially the crux of the controversy. So he took this image of the cow skull alongside several others at different angles and different backdrops in May of 1936, all in the Badlands of South Dakota. So this region was not experiencing drought conditions at that time, first of all, but also second of all, it is just really dry in the Badlands of South Dakota at any time. So it's very dry in this region, and that's not unusual for Badlands at all. So it's not an image of drought, essentially. So Rothstein took these images, he sent them back to Washington, which was sort of the normal thing to do, and then again, as part of that normal process, they were made available. All of the photographs from the RA were made available for use by the Associated Press, right? Because it's government made, so it has to be publicly available. So later that year, some of these pictures were picked up by Eastern newspapers as an image of the drought that was by then, later in the summer, ravaging the Great Plains region. So newspapers in the Dakotas then hear about this and accuse Rothstein and the whole of the New Deal of being liars and frauds in September of 1936, which was just as FDR, President Roosevelt, is making his highly publicized train journey through the Plains states. So it blows up, people are very upset, it's a lot of bad publicity for FDR just as he's making this sort of like drought tour through the Dust Bowl states, and it caused a big ruckus. And as you can imagine, the image that I showed earlier with the cow skull over the dust storm was not very good. So the RA quickly got rid of it. So this is an image of another exhibit page recorded at a different public exhibition, essentially, that the RA was part of, also in 1936, and you can see some of the changes that the RA has made here, right? So they, first of all, added some more striking figures. It's now 9 million acres of wasted, worn-out land, but they've also hastily removed Rothstein's skull, and you can kind of see the outlines. I think it sort of still shows up of where the skull used to be, so no controversy here, no sir. All good. Now, what's interesting here, other than obviously this hilarious attempt to get rid of the cow skull, is that the controversy was really based on two main claims. So the first is that Rothstein took so many photographs with that skull that it essentially, they were accused of invalidating the RA's claim to producing pure documentary, right? If you're moving things around, then you're not actually accurately documenting what was happening, which is kind of an interesting claim in and of itself, asking us to think about what documentary means for us. But the other kind of main part of the controversy was that these images were falsely presented as depicting the Dust Bowl. So the use of the skull photographs by Eastern newspapers and indeed by the Resettlement Administration in these 1936 exhibitions demonstrate a lack of familiarity with dryland ecologies and a simplistic association between aridity, drought, and degradation. The images from the Badlands were not depicting drought, and you can even see the grass of rangelands in the background of the second photo here. Even though Rothstein has titled it overgrazed land, you can see that these are likely still in use as rangeland. And so similarly, also as other critics have pointed out, if you are familiar with the practice of raising livestock in dry regions, it's possible to see that the skull pictured is that of an older steer who lived a long life and whose remains have likely been out in the sun for years. This cow is not a victim of the drought, which was then unfolding across the Great Plains. But the skull photographs were successfully passed off as images of the drought because of the same widely held assumptions that support all desertification narratives. The idea that droughts can lead to the formation of deserts, and the idea that deserts are bad, deadly places. Now, aside from villainizing deserts, this kind of misrepresentation also confuses what drought and land degradation really are. Drought, which refers to a period of abnormal dryness in a region, is a natural process that occurs in arid lands across the globe. It can be devastating and dangerous, yes, but it's a fact of life in dry lands, a term which encompasses both arid and semi-arid regions like the Great Plains. So a region that's experiencing drought is not necessarily experiencing degradation, which refers in turn to a decline in soil health and or soil productivity. The two concepts are often related and impact each other, but in that degraded soils are more severely impacted by drought, but they are not the same thing. So ideas like desertification, which readily combine these two issues, suggest in essence that dryness itself is a kind of problem to be solved by land management, as demonstrated in this image from the exhibit, right? Which sort of suggests that with the right treatment, the semi-arid grasslands of the Great Plains could become abundant with water, a kind of freshwater lake or swimming hole or whatever those lovely trio of swimmers is about to dive into. And so this highlights in particular a dangerous aspect of the desertification narrative. By framing dryness itself as a problem and as a sign of degradation, desertification has been used to blame local people for the arid conditions in which they live. So you can essentially villainize any desert space if you see dryness itself as the problem. So this brings us then to the origins of the term itself. Desertification emerged from French colonies in North Africa in the early 20th century, where it was frequently used by colonial governments to justify the forced implementation of European land management policies. Policies which, ironically, were largely unsuited to drylands and, as political ecologist Diana K. Davis has pointed out, led to much degradation in these regions. Indeed, Davis has written convincingly of the neo-colonial uses to which desertification continues to be utilized. So my examination of desertification discourse within the Dust Bowl period is substantially different than this context of colonial Africa. Though both are, of course, colonial contexts, critically, the degraded conditions on the North American Great Plains really were due to poor land management. The drought, a natural process in the region, only exacerbated an already bad situation on the plains. So while it's simplistic to blame individual farmers who were, after all, acting in accordance with policies that encouraged rapid settlement and intensive cultivation, and were working within an economic system that worked on the boom and bust of the market rather than the healthy maintenance of soils, it is still certainly true that the Dust Bowl was an anthropogenic disaster, which is part of the reason why it was so challenging to address and also to discuss. So the Great Plains region had experienced drought before, but this really was quite markedly different. It was an environmental crisis caused by humans and which existed on a new scale that hadn't really been seen before, one that perhaps required new avenues of communication. So returning to Rothstein's skull photographs, it's true that these were not really drought pictures. And while the RA's image of the death-bearing dust cloud lacks accuracy as well, it's also important to remember that there really was a terrible drought occurring in the Dakotas in the late summer of 1936, when the skull images were being circulated in the press. In other words, there was a need to find images, language, and symbols that could communicate the scale of the crisis on the plains. There was a need to drum up political support to address it. To complicate matters further, drought and land degradation both happen so slowly as to be rendered largely invisible. That is, until they reach a certain level of severity, which was the case with the Dust Bowl. It was a uniquely visual disaster. Most of the time, drought and land degradation appear in far less visual symptoms, such as lower crop yields, which simply doesn't bring an image to mind in the same way that desertification does. Desert imagery, functioning as it does in the photographs as exaggerated depictions of dryness, can help to make these conditions more comprehensible. But this visibility relies on the perpetuation of a harmful misunderstanding of desert lands, as well as the crises of drought and land degradation. And so this is the sort of central tension of desertification discourse.